my husband of 25 years decided my menopause made me unstable. He started documenting my every mood swing, my every moment of forgetfulness, planning to use it against me in our divorce. He thought he could gaslight me into giving up everything for his new younger mistress. He forgot one small detail. I'm a clinical psychologist. He wasn't just starting a fight, he was becoming my most fascinating and most predictable case study. Before I begin my story, I just want to say thank you for listening to me pour my heart out. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. I love hearing from you all. It reminds me I'm not alone in this. Now let me tell you what SHE did to me. My name is Dr. Althea Henderson, and for 25 years, my life's work has been the human mind. As a clinical psychologist, I have dedicated my career to deciphering its complexities, to understanding its fragile architecture, to healing its wounds. I have diagnosed narcissists, comforted victims of gaslighting, amples give tit-guided patients through the treacherous landscapes of their own psyches. I thought I was an expert in the field of emotional manipulation. I had no idea that my own husband was about to make me his final, most personal case study. At 48, I was navigating a new chapter in my own life. The unpredictable, often frustrating journey of perimenopause. The symptoms were real, manageable, but undeniably present. A sudden, intense hot flash during a patient session. A night of restless, hormone-fueled insomnia. A moment of brain fog where a familiar name would momentarily elude me. They were the normal, natural shifts of a woman's body, things I understood with a clinical, dispassionate clarity. But my husband Gregory had started to see them differently. Greg, at 50, was in the throes of a midlife crisis so spectacular, so cliched, it would have been comical if it weren't so destructive. He had traded his sensible sedan for a low-slung sports car that was impossible for him to get out of with his bad back. He had started wearing designer tracksuits that were 2 sizes too tight and cologne that was 2 decades too young. And he had, I was beginning to suspect, acquired a new accessory. A mistress. Her name was Kayla Monroe, a 26-year-old junior marketing assistant at his firm, a girl with bright, hungry eyes and an ambition that was as sharp and as dangerous as a shard of glass. I saw the way he looked at her at his company's holiday party, the way he laughed a little too loudly at her jokes. I noticed the late-night strategy sessions, the sudden, unexplained business trips. And I noticed his language began to change. He started weaponizing the very terminology of my profession against me. My occasional hormone-driven mood swings were no longer just that. They were clear signs of emotional dysregulation. My moments of menopausal brain fog were not a normal symptom. They were evidence of significant cognitive decline. He would listen to my frustrations about a hot flash, his face a mask of deep clinical concern, and he would say things like, "Althea, darling, are you sure this isn't psychosomatic? Your anxiety about aging could be manifesting in these physical symptoms." He was gaslighting me, a slow, insidious poisoning of my own reality. And he was using the language he had learned from me, from our 25 years of marriage, from the books on my own shelves, to do it. The cruelty was in its subtlety. He would forget to tell me about important social engagements, then feign surprise and concern when I became flustered. "See, Althea," he'd say, his voice full of a patronizing pity. "Your memory, it's just not what it used to be. It's okay. I'm here to help you." He would question my professional judgment. "Are you sure you're up for seeing that many patients today, honey? With your instability, maybe you should lighten your caseload." His new young mistress, Kayla, I was sure, was the one feeding him this new toxic script. I could almost hear her, whispering in his ear, flattering his ego, telling him he was a brilliant, vibrant man being held back by his aging, unstable wife. She was the sycophant, the opportunist, the one who saw my husband not as a man to love, but as a ladder to be climbed. And Greg, my husband of 25 years, the man I had supported, loved, and built a life with, was a textbook narcissist. A man so desperate for admiration, so terrified of his own aging, that he was willing to pathologize his own wife to justify his betrayal. I was not a fool. I was a clinical psychologist. I saw the pattern. I recognized the tactics. But knowing and feeling are two very different things. His words, his constant subtle questioning of my sanity, my competence, my very reality began to take their toll. I started to doubt myself, to second-guess my own perceptions. The hot flashes felt hotter, the moments of forgetfulness more frequent. His gaslighting was a self-fulfilling prophecy. I knew he was having an affair. I knew he was building a case against me, a narrative that would absolve him of all guilt when he finally decided to leave. I was tired. Tired of fighting, tired of the constant low-level warfare in my own home. A part of me, the part that still loved the man he used to be, just wanted peace. I had no idea that the peace he was about to offer was the peace of a battlefield after a devastating final assault. An assault that would be designed to leave me with nothing but the ruins of my own shattered mind. The final brutal act of my husband's psychological warfare campaign came on a Tuesday, the day after our 25th wedding anniversary. I had tried to mark the occasion with a quiet, elegant dinner at home, a gesture of hope, a foolish attempt to reconnect with the man I had married. Greg had been distant, irritable, his eyes constantly flicking to his phone, which buzzed with a relentless stream of messages he refused to answer in front of me. The meal was a tense, silent affair, the air thick with unspoken resentments. The next morning he confronted me in our sunlit kitchen, a place that had once been the warm heart of our home. He was holding a small leather-bound notebook, his face set in an expression of grave, theatrical sorrow. "Althea," he began, his voice a low, somber tone he had likely rehearsed with his young mistress Kayla. "We need to talk. I've been keeping a journal. Documenting things. For my own clarity." "Documenting what, Greg?" I asked, my voice weary, my heart already bracing for the blow I knew was coming. Your instability, darling," he said, his voice dripping with a false, pitying sympathy that made my skin crawl. He opened the notebook. "Last Monday, a prolonged weeping episode over a misplaced set of car keys. Thursday, an irrational, angry outburst about my needing to work late. Saturday, a full day of profound lethargy and what you described as a fog you couldn't shake." He was reading a list of my own vulnerabilities, my own private struggles with the very real, very normal symptoms of perimenopause, and he was presenting them as evidence for a case against my sanity. He had taken my moments of weakness and had catalogued them, weaponized them. "I'm worried about you, Althea," he continued, his gaze full of a practiced, soulful concern. "More than that, I'm worried for myself. For my own mental health. Living in this emotionally volatile environment, it's become untenable. It's toxic." That was her word. Kayla's word. The buzzword of a generation that pathologized every uncomfortable human emotion. I stared at him, at this man I had shared a bed with for a quarter of a century, and I felt a profound sense of detachment, the clinical interest of a psychologist observing a particularly fascinating, particularly monstrous case study. The narcissism was breathtaking. His own infidelity, his own lies, his own neglect, they were all irrelevant. The problem in his world was my reaction to them. My pain was the disease. "And what is your proposed solution, Greg?" I asked, my voice as calm and as clinical as his own. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for his final, devastating pronouncement. "I'm leaving, Althea," he said, the words a clean, sharp, surgical cut. I need to protect my own peace, my own stability. I found someone who understands me. Someone who is stable. Kayla." He said her name without a flicker of shame. "And I don't think it's healthy for us to continue living together while we sort things out." He was leaving me. For her. And he was using my own supposed instability as his justification, his get-out-of-jail-free card. "But the most important thing, Althea," he continued, his voice now a low, almost threatening murmur, "is that we handle this divorce intelligently. Amicably. I have my notes, my documentation of your condition. I would hate to have to use them in a court of law. It would be so embarrassing for you. For your career. A psychologist who can't even manage her own mind." The threat was clear and it was vile. He was blackmailing me. He was telling me that if I did not give him an easy, favorable divorce, if I did not walk away quietly and let him have the lion's share of our assets, he would publicly humiliate me, destroy my professional reputation, by painting me as a crazy, menopausal woman. His cruelty was so profound, so complete, it was almost a work of art. He had not just betrayed me. He had constructed a narrative so twisted, so insidious, that it sought to make me a willing, complicit partner in my own destruction. I looked at him, at his handsome, self-satisfied face, at the small, pathetic notebook of my supposed sins in his hand, and I felt the last vestiges of my love for him, my hope for him, turn to ash. The heartbroken wife was gone. The psychologist, however, the one who understood the fragile, predictable ego of a narcissist, was very much present. "I see, Greg," I said, my voice quiet, my gaze steady. "You have certainly given me a great deal to consider. I will need some time to process this." He smiled then, a small, triumphant smile of a man who believes he has just won comprehensively. "Of course," he said magnanimously. "Take all the time you need. I'll have my lawyer send over the preliminary settlement papers tomorrow." He turned and walked out of the kitchen, out of my life, leaving me alone in the sunlit room with the ruins of our marriage. He thought he had me trapped, that my fear of public shame would make me compliant. He had no idea that he had just made a fatal, catastrophic mistake. He had tried to use the language of my profession as a weapon against me. He had no idea that I was about to use it to perform a complete and very public psychological autopsy on his own rotten narcissistic soul. He had declared me unstable. He was about to find out what a truly stable, truly intelligent, and truly furious woman was capable of. The hours after Greg left were a strange, silent whirlwind. My heart, the part of me that was still a wife of 25 years, was shattered, a broken, weeping thing. But my mind, the part of me that was Dr. Althea Henderson, clinical psychologist, was icily, terrifyingly calm. It was as if a switch had been flipped. The emotional, vulnerable participant in a dying marriage had been sidelined, and the cool, analytical observer had taken control. I did not weep. I did not rage. I made a pot of tea, took out a fresh legal pad, and I began to work. I began to build a case file on my own husband. His parting words, his threat to use my instability against me in court, had been a declaration of war. But he had made a critical error. He had chosen to fight me on my own territory. He wanted to talk about psychology, about mental stability, about personality disorders. Excellent. Let's talk. I began to document everything, not with the rambling pain of a heartbroken wife, but with the dispassionate diagnostic precision of a clinician. I made a timeline of his behavior over the past 2 years, since Kayla had entered his life. The escalating gaslighting, the manipulative language, the projection of his own failings onto me, the pathological lying, the clear, almost textbook lack of empathy. As I wrote, a clear, undeniable picture began to emerge. A picture I had on some level been avoiding for years, blinded by my own love and hope. My husband, Gregory Vance, was not just a cheating middle-aged man having a cliched affair. He was a classic narcissist. A man with a profound and likely undiagnosed personality disorder. Grandiose sense of self-importance. He truly believed he was the visionary, the titan, whose happiness and stability were paramount. Need for excessive admiration. He had discarded me, his partner of 25 years, for a young, sycophantic mistress who fed his ego with constant empty praise. Lack of empathy? A profound, devastating check. His inability to comprehend, let alone care about, the immense pain his actions were causing me was a hallmark of the disorder. Sense of entitlement? He felt entitled to my silence, my compliance, my assets, my home. Manipulative and exploitative? Check and double check. He had systematically used my own natural biological processes as a tool to gaslight me, to control me, to justify his own betrayal. The list went on. The arrogance, the rage when challenged, the inability to take responsibility for his own actions. It was all there, a textbook case study, a clinical diagnosis I was now making in my own kitchen. The knowledge was both devastating and strangely empowering. It was devastating to finally, fully, admit to myself that the man I had loved and built a life with was, and likely always had been, incapable of real love, of real partnership. But it was empowering because it gave me a framework, a strategy. Gave me my power back. He thought he could use the vague, misunderstood concept of menopausal instability as a weapon against me. He had no idea I was about to counter with a precise, clinical and legally formidable diagnosis of his own profound personality disorder. My grief for the man he was, for the marriage we had, transformed into a cold, clinical resolve. He had tried to use my field of expertise, my life's work, against me. I would now use my own superior knowledge of that very field to dismantle him, to expose him, to ensure that his narcissistic cruelty would not just be a private pain for me, but a public legal fact for him. I went to my bookshelf and pulled down my copy of the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the Bible of my profession. I began to cross-reference my notes on Greg's behavior with the specific diagnostic criteria for narcissistic personality disorder. The match was chilling. The match was perfect. He had threatened to put my mind on trial. I decided in that moment to accept his challenge. But it would not just be my mind under the microscope. It would be his. And I, the psychologist he had so foolishly underestimated, would be the one providing the expert testimony. That evening I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I called my old mentor from my doctoral program, a woman who was now one of the country's leading forensic psychologists. I told her the story not as a wife, but as a colleague presenting a particularly difficult case. When I finished, she was silent for a moment. "Althea," she said finally, her voice full of a grim professional respect, "he is a classic malignant narcissist. And he has made the fatal mistake of trying to gaslight an expert. What do you intend to do?" "I intend," I replied, my voice steady, my purpose clear, "to suggest a mutual psychological evaluation as part of our divorce proceedings. A full, comprehensive, court-ordered evaluation. By a neutral third party." I heard her let out a low, appreciative whistle. "A bold move, Althea. A very bold move. He'll think it's his chance to prove you're unstable." "I know," I said, a small, cold smile on my lips. "That's what I'm counting on. He's so arrogant, so convinced of his own superiority, he will walk right into the trap. He has no idea that a real forensic evaluation will see right through his charming facade to the empty, disordered core beneath." My plan was set. It was a high-stakes gamble, a move that would require me to subject my own mind to the scrutiny of the court. But I was not afraid. My mind was my strength. My mind was my weapon. And my unstable menopausal brain was about to become my husband's worst nightmare. The next morning I walked into the office of the sharpest divorce lawyer in the city, a woman named Diane Warren, whose reputation for dismantling arrogant husbands was legendary. I did not come to her as a weeping, heartbroken wife. I came to her as a clinical psychologist, presenting a case file. I laid out the situation, the impending divorce, Greg's affair with his young mistress, Kayla. And then I detailed his campaign of psychological warfare, his weaponization of my perimenopausal symptoms, his threats to have me declared unstable in court. "He believes," I concluded, my voice calm and analytical, "that he can use a fabricated narrative of my mental decline to secure a divorce settlement that is vastly in his favor." Diane listened, her intelligent eyes narrowing, a dangerous, predatory smile playing on her lips. "He sounds like a textbook narcissist, Dr. Henderson," she said. "He is," I confirmed. "And that is precisely what we are going to prove." As I had predicted, Greg's lawyer sent over the preliminary settlement offer a few days later. It was an insult, a document that sought to give him the majority of our assets, including our home and a significant portion of my private practice's value, citing my diminished capacity to manage them. Diane and I met to draft our response. "His entire case," she said, tapping the offensive document, "is built on the flimsy foundation of him, a marketing executive, diagnosing you, a clinical psychologist, with instability. It's ludicrous. We can fight it, of course. We can get our own experts. But it will be a long, ugly," she said, battle. "I have a different idea," I said, leaning forward. "A more direct approach." I then laid out my plan, the one I had formulated in the cold, clear light of my righteous fury. "We don't just defend against his claims," I explained. "We go on the offensive. We agree with him. We agree that the mental and emotional state of both parties is, indeed, a crucial factor in the dissolution of this marriage." Diane looked at me, a flicker of intrigued confusion in her eyes. "And therefore," I continued, "we will file a motion with the court. We will propose a comprehensive, court-ordered, mutual psychological evaluation. For both of us. To be conducted by a neutral, court-appointed forensic psychologist. We will frame it as a responsible, modern approach to an amicable divorce. A way to assess the overall mental and emotional health of the partnership and to determine any underlying personality disorders that may have contributed to the marital breakdown." Diane stared at me for a long moment, her mouth slightly agape. Then she let out a roar of delighted, appreciative laughter. "Oh, you are brilliant, Dr. Henderson," she said, her eyes shining with a fierce, joyful light. "Absolutely, brilliantly, viciously brilliant. It's a gambit of pure genius. He won't be able to resist it, I said. His ego is too large. He's so convinced of his own superiority, so certain of my instability, that he will see it as his ultimate opportunity to be proven right, to have his narrative validated by a neutral, professional. He will walk right into the trap. And when he does, Diane said, her smile now a wolfish grin, a real forensic psychologist will see him for exactly what he is. They are trained to spot narcissistic traits from a mile away. His charm, his manipulations, they won't work on an expert. He will unravel on the stand, so to speak. Our motion was filed the following week. It was a masterpiece of legal prose, full of reasonable therapeutic language about clarity, understanding, and conscious uncoupling. It was a trap, baited with the very psychological jargon Greg himself had used to torment me. As we predicted, he took the bait. Hook, line, and sinker. His lawyer called Diane almost immediately, agreeing to the mutual evaluation. Greg was, I was told, thrilled by the opportunity to have my condition professionally documented. He was so blinded by his own arrogance, so certain of his own cleverness, that he could not see the gaping obvious flaw in his own logic, that he too would be under the microscope. The court appointed a Dr. Evelyn Reed, one of the most respected forensic psychologists in the state, a woman known for her sharp mind and her utter intolerance for deceit. The evaluations were scheduled. I prepared for my own sessions with a calm sense of purpose. I gathered my journals, my notes, my own professional understanding of my hormonal and emotional state. I was not afraid of the truth. I was ready to present my mind in all its complexity to a fellow professional. Greg, on the other hand, likely prepared by preening in front of a mirror, rehearsing his lines, practicing his performance of the long-suffering husband. He was preparing for a battle of charm. He had no idea he was walking into a clinical psychological dissection from which his fragile, disordered ego would not emerge intact. The legal gambit had been accepted. The stage was set for a quiet, clinical, and utterly devastating takedown. The psychological evaluations took place over 2 weeks in Dr. Reed's quiet, elegantly appointed office. It was a neutral territory, a place of hushed tones and deep analytical scrutiny, a world away from the emotional chaos of my own home. My sessions with Dr. Reed were intense, but they were a relief. I spoke to her not as a patient but as a colleague, a fellow professional. I laid out my experience of perimenopause with clinical precision. The hormonal fluctuations, the anxiety, the moments of brain fog. I was honest about my sadness, my anger, my feelings of being devalued and dismissed by my husband. I did not perform. I simply presented the truth of my experience, the experience of a healthy, intelligent 48-year-old woman navigating a natural, if challenging, life transition, all while enduring a campaign of psychological abuse from her husband. Dr. Reed listened, her expression calm, her questions sharp and insightful. I could see in her eyes not a judgment of my instability, but a professional recognition of my resilience, my self-awareness, and the classic patterns of the narcissistic abuse I was describing. Greg's sessions, I can only imagine, were a different matter entirely. He walked into that office, I am sure, with the confident swagger of a man who believed he was about to outsmart the system. He would have been charming, charismatic, his performance of the long-suffering husband polished to a high shine. He would have presented his journal of my supposed lapses, with an air of grave concern. He would have spoken of my emotional volatility, with a deep, sorrowful sigh. But a true forensic psychologist like Dr. Reed is trained to see past the performance. She is trained to spot the subtle tells of a narcissist. His grandiosity. His lack of genuine empathy. His tendency to see himself as the perpetual victim, even when he is the clear aggressor. And under the pressure of her relentless, insightful questioning, his charming facade would have begun to crack. She would have challenged his narrative, asked him to account for his own actions, for his affair with Kayla, for his own emotional state. And when a narcissist is challenged, when their carefully constructed sense of superiority is threatened, they do not respond with introspection. They respond with rage. I did not have to imagine his unraveling. Diane, my lawyer, was given a copy of Dr. Reed's final report, and she read me excerpts over the phone, her voice full of a quiet, grim satisfaction. The report was a devastating clinical takedown of my husband's character. It concluded that I, Dr. Althea Henderson, was a highly intelligent, self-aware and mentally sound individual experiencing expected situational distress in response to a significant marital betrayal and a normal life transition. My symptoms, Dr. Reed wrote, were entirely consistent with a rational response to psychological abuse and gaslighting. And Greg. The report on him was a masterpiece of clinical diagnosis. Dr. Reed noted his grandiose sense of self-importance, his profound lack of empathy for his wife's emotional and physical state, his tendency towards manipulative and coercive behavior, and his inability to accept any personal responsibility for the dissolution of his marriage. The final, damning summary was a clinical checkmate. While a definitive diagnosis would require further observation, Diane read from the report, Mr. Gregory Vance exhibits a significant number of traits consistent with narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, as defined by the DSM-5. His attempts to pathologize his wife's normal menopausal symptoms appear to be a classic case of projection and a manipulative tactic designed to justify his own infidelities and to secure an advantageous position in divorce proceedings. It was all there. In black and white. In the cool, dispassionate and legally unimpeachable language of a court-appointed expert. He had tried to use psychology as a weapon against me, and that very same weapon had been turned back on him with a devastating, irrefutable force. His narrative was not just challenged, it was professionally, clinically, utterly demolished. The report was filed with the court. A copy was sent to his lawyer. I imagine the moment Greg read it, the moment he saw his own disordered personality laid bare on the page, diagnosed by an expert he could not dismiss, in a context he could not escape. His rage, I was sure, would be immense. But so would his fear. He had walked into that evaluation so certain of his victory, so convinced of his own cleverness. He had no idea that his own personality, his own profound and unexamined sickness, was the one thing he could not lie his way out of. The trap had been sprung. The narcissist had been unmasked. And the final legal judgment was now all but a foregone conclusion. The final divorce settlement hearing was not a battle. It was a surrender. Greg and his lawyer, Mr. Davenport, walked into the courtroom looking like men who had already been defeated. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a sullen, resentful silence. The court ordered psychological evaluation, the very tool they had intended to use to destroy me, had instead become the cornerstone of my victory. Dr. Reed's devastating report had been submitted as evidence, and its clinical, impartial assessment of Greg's narcissistic traits had completely reframed the entire case. Greg's lawyer made a few feeble attempts to argue, to salvage something from the wreckage. He spoke of Greg's contributions to the marriage, of his right to a fair share of the assets. But his arguments were hollow, his words devoid of their usual slick confidence. How could he argue for a man who had been professionally identified as a manipulative, gaslighting narcissist? When it was Diane Warren's turn to speak, she did not need to be aggressive. She was calm, precise, and utterly ruthless. She stood before the judge, Dr. Reed's report in her hand, and she laid out our final position. Your Honor, she began, her voice ringing with a cold, clear authority, this was never a simple case of a marriage ending due to irreconcilable differences. This was a case of long-term psychological abuse, of a husband systematically attempting to pathologize his wife's natural life processes in order to justify his own infidelity and to secure a fraudulent financial advantage. She then used the diagnosis from the report as her primary weapon. The court-appointed expert's evaluation, she continued, has confirmed that my client, Dr. Althea Henderson, was the victim of a pattern of coercive control, a pattern consistent with being married to an individual with significant narcissistic personality traits. Mr. Vance's actions were not just unkind, they were a form of abuse. And that abuse has had a tangible and legally recognized cost. She then presented our final settlement proposal, a proposal that was no longer about a 50-50 split. It was about damages. It was about justice. We are arguing, Your Honor, she declared, that due to Mr. Vance's documented history of emotional abuse, his fraudulent misrepresentation of his wife's mental state, and his attempt to manipulate this very court, my client is entitled to a significantly larger portion of the marital assets as compensation for the profound psychological and professional harm she has endured. We are petitioning for her to be awarded the family home free and clear, as well as a 75% share of all joint investments and Mr. Vance's retirement funds. Greg's head snapped up, his face a mask of horrified disbelief. 75%. The family home. It was a complete financial annihilation. His lawyer shot to his feet, sputtering objections. But the judge, a woman who had clearly read every word of Dr. Reed's report, held up a hand, silencing him. She looked down at Greg, her eyes narrowed with a profound judicial contempt. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice like cracking ice, "you came before this court and you attempted to use a woman's age and her biology as a weapon against her. You tried to paint a picture of a successful, intelligent and mentally sound clinical psychologist as an unstable, erratic woman, all to cover for your own pathetic, cliched midlife crisis and your affair with a younger woman. You did not just lie to your wife, sir. You attempted to perpetrate a fraud upon this court. And that is something this court does not take lightly." Her final judgment was swift and it was brutal. She awarded me everything we had asked for. The house. The lion's share of our investments. A significant portion of his retirement funds. She cited the expert's clinical findings of significant narcissistic traits as the legal justification for the punitive and unequal distribution of our assets. His own narcissism, the very thing that made him feel so superior, so entitled, so certain of his own victory, had become the legal reason he lost everything. He just sat there, stunned into a complete abject silence as the judge's gavel fell, shattering the last of his arrogant delusions. His affair had cost him his marriage. His lies had cost him his reputation. And his narcissism finally had cost him his fortune. I walked out of that courtroom a free woman. The divorce was finalized. The assets were mine. My home was secure. My peace was my own. Kayla, his young mistress, I heard, had vanished at the first sign of his financial implosion, her love as fleeting as the money she had hoped to gain. Greg was left alone, a man in his 50s, with nothing but his own disordered personality for company. He had said he regretted marrying me. But as I sat in my quiet, peaceful home, a home that was now entirely, unequivocally mine, I knew with a certainty that was both sad and profoundly satisfying, that the one thing Greg Vance now regretted more than anything else in his entire foolish life, was the day he so arrogantly, so stupidly decided to divorce the one person who truly understood him. The psychologist who had finally, after 25 long years, completed her final devastating diagnosis.